Sorry for the wait for those who've been in the chat room for the last few minutes, but I think we should probably be good to go. So hello and welcome to another episode of the ICC Academy COVID-19 Briefing, an interactive video series where we explore the economic and health implications of this coronavirus pandemic and what must be done to ensure successful recovery for businesses big and small. I'm your host, Thomas Paris, and in this episode, we will discuss the ICC AOK Pass project and how it will enable your business to develop a safer and more efficient path to commercial recovery. So joining us today, once again, is John Denton, Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce. We have Dr. Chester Drum, also returning guest, who is a co-founder of the ICC AOK Pass and cardiologist and physician at the National University Hospital in Singapore. And we also have Dr. Shyam Govender, who is a new face for the ICC webinars, who is a global medical advisor and coordinating doctor at Asia International SOS. And finally, our moderator, once again, is Dorji Sun, CEO of Perlin.net. So just a quick thing, Dr. Shyam unfortunately won't be able to join us by video, but she will be joining the discussion with her audio. So we appreciate your patience on that one. And for the questions during the session, we'll start by running through a few prepared topics and slides, followed by an audience Q&A session at the end. So we invite you to send your questions in the chat and we'll go through them together near the end. So let's kick things off. Dorji, over to you.
Thank you, Thomas. And thank you everyone for joining us. Today is actually what I think is a situation where the COVID pandemic is getting even more interesting. I think a lot of people have a sense of burnout. We've all been through various circuit breakers and lockdowns. We've reopened. In some cases, we're being re-locked down. There seems to be a bit of almost a malaise. People are a bit over inundated with the news. But what's really to frame the conversation today, we're up to now nearly 14 million infections. We've got a situation where, hundreds of thousands of people, the latest numbers were over 600,000 people have unfortunately died because of COVID. And yet governments don't seem to have a concerted approach. Businesses are trying to take the lead of sovereign governments, not quite getting the right, guidance or frameworks. And so the topic for today is, how do you comply with COVID-19 sort of regulation? How do businesses come back to return to work, return to sport, return to play, return to school? And so that's why we're very, very, very privileged to have the panel today. We have John Denton, the Secretary General, talking about macro issues, looking at the global approach and some of the conversations he's had around sovereigns. We've got Dr. Shyam, who's going to be speaking about how businesses are returning, International SOS being one of the world's largest medical service providers, servicing over 2/3 of the Fortune 500. And we've got, of course, Professor Chester Drum, who's been working intimately architecting the solutions and actually deploying real pilots for AOK Pass. So coming back to John, I think the first sort of conversation starter, I guess, for the audience would really be, what's your bird's eye view, macro view of the way that economies, businesses, governments are responding to COVID or not responding to COVID, and how are you seeing multilateralism, international institutions, looking at that? We are now today mid-July, and we're now quite deep into this situation. Where are you seeing the journey we've walked over the first 2 quarters of this year?
Well, sadly, when we last caught up, we had commentators engaged in the conversation, and immediately prior, the best view from the experts was that we'd be through this by September. And actually, that was the general view, that we would be through this by September. I think what we've seen is that we've gone deeper into the challenges of COVID, and I think that the general proposition now is, how do we live and how do we function with COVID-19, and how do we both save lives and livelihoods has become a much stronger question. Originally, I think the focus was really very much on saving lives, and then of course the reality with the massive attack as a consequence of the way COVID plays on the real economy, and the realization that even in economies like sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Central America and Latin America, which at the time were actually not particularly prone to the outbreaks of COVID, were actually being devastated from a real economy point of view. And when we talk about real economy, it's the collapse of supply chains, which the consequence of which was the collapse of opportunities for SMEs and micro SMEs. It was the inability of governments to prime the pump to actually get cash into the real economy to support. Clearly, there's a difference between a number of developed economies which actually have what's called a fiscal headroom to do that. But in a lot of developing middle economies, middle-income economies, LDCs, they just don't have the fiscal headroom to actually prime the pump and get the cash out. So there's a lot of different focal points that started flowing through. And so the challenge of living with COVID is not just a health challenge, but it's also a livelihood challenge, and that's become clearer. What I said then, and I would repeat it now, and in the sense it's a more authoritative statement, that the black swan in all this has not been the existence of a pandemic. In fact, most economies with a sophisticated, I think, infrastructure had planned for some form of pandemic. The black swan in all this has actually been the lack of international cooperation and the lack of international leadership. And I think the telling point here has been the failure, actually, of a number of the multilateral institutions to live up to their promise. And that's in a way because of the lack of leadership, which has been evidenced there. We've seen that, I think, with some of the challenges with the UN system to actually function effectively. We've seen that with challenges to the Bretton Woods institutions to deliver on their promises. We've seen that in the challenges of a number of regional groups. We at the ICC see that most glaringly with the inability of a number of governments to coordinate their positions, to not only engage with the private sector to fight the pandemic, but also to engage with the private sector effectively to help save the livelihoods of their citizens. And that's where we've seen our role. I mean, as a global institution which has reach in the developed and in the developing world, our job is to actually get involved and do stuff. I mean, use what levers we have. And the way we saw our response was threefold. One was very much in rescuing, and frankly, and I think we've discussed before, Dorji, that one of the challenges here is that, I think I might have indicated this in my very opening remarks, is that the way the pandemic plays is not in a coordinated fashion. It's actually asynchronous. So simultaneously within the world, we have parts of the world where we're still in what's called rescue phase, other parts of the world we're in what's called healthy reboot or safe reboot, and other parts of the world we're even talking now about what a resilient recovery can look like. And we're doing that not in an orderly fashion, we're doing that simultaneously, but just with different priorities. And that requires us to actually operate in a very agile way. So from our point of view, we've been working and we continue to work on just keeping businesses afloat, keeping businesses running. At the same time as we've been developing tools, and we'll talk about ICC Pass to help with a healthy reboot. And actually right now we're also engaged in setting out the parameters for what we think a resilient recovery could look like. That's the kind of role of the ICC. And also early, we saw that one of the challenges was, as I said, the failure of a number of governments, but frankly, a number of institutions and multilateral level to engage properly with the private sector, which, if you look at the most recent Edelman Trust Barometer, the institution that people trust most is actually not government. It's actually their bosses, their businesses, the people who run the organizations that provide their livelihoods. They're the ones they look to for advice. And yet when you look at how a lot of pandemic strategies were developed, it's more than 65 or almost 70% of countries did not have a plan to engage the private sector. So one of our first tasks was to actually ensure that engagement was there. The best way of doing that and the quickest way of doing that was to reach out to the WHO and actually work with the WHO to help them engage with the private sector. because getting their messages out and ensuring their messages were understood and relied upon required those messages to be delivered through the private sector mechanism. And that's one thing we've been doing. And actually, we may not talk about it today, but I think on another call with the Academy, we'll talk about what has been the historic ICC WHO survey, which has been conducted, the first global survey done of engagement through the private sector with businesses, and has proven to be very helpful in helping guide the WHO on better tools to use to engage, and also ensuring that we're able to reach out and speak to business as well. So as I said, one of our roles then is to stand up as a functioning institution with a global reach of 45 million businesses in the north and the south and the developed and developing world, an institution that has a lot of trust accorded to it. It's actually been to stand up. Our purpose is to enable business worldwide. And as I said, part of our job is to rescue business. And so we're seeing already, and I think, Dorothy, you and I have been talking about this, and one of the areas of great activity that we're engaged with at the moment has been, how do we ensure we get cash, get money, get support to the real economy, particularly in developing economies and LDCs, and now actually in middle income economies as well. That comes in twofold. One is just getting the money there, ensuring there's money available. So working with international financial institutions, with regional development banks, with governments about alternate and better ways of mobilizing that finance, access to that finance. And frankly, using the playbook from the global financial crisis is hopeless in this environment. The global financial crisis was about saving the financial system. This is about saving the real economy. So we have to think a lot more creatively and act more creatively. And that's what we've been doing, and giving guidance and actually doing it ourselves, enabling through our chambers of commerce, through the payment systems that we can access through e-commerce platforms, getting that funding out there and legitimizing that for use. It's not perfect, and certainly it has not been 100% successful. But I tell you what, without it, it would have been a lot worse. The next issue we're confronting on the real economy is the collapse of trade finance. It's kind of functioning at the moment, but that's only because global trade has collapsed. But if you want to reboot the world, you actually have to get trade moving. And part of that is getting trade finance moving. And at the moment, there's just not enough liquidity in the system. And so we've launched an ICC a trade finance action group, which will be chaired by Victor Full out of Hong Kong, with Marcus Wallenberg out of SEB in Sweden. The whole idea of which is to mobilize all the different levers to create the opportunity to dramatically increase the liquidity available in trade finance. And frankly, we anticipate at the moment, if we want to get trade back to the volumes required, we need to acknowledge that there's probably a $3 to $4 trillion trade finance gap. So we're working on that as well. But the other issue, and I said a healthy or safe reboot is really important. And one thing we've noticed is that a number of countries now recognize that suppression rather than eradication is the way you live with COVID-19 until a vaccine is found. But part of suppression is that they can't continue to suppress the functioning of their economy. And in particular, we're seeing with opening up economies, we're also seeing opening up borders. And one of the challenges we saw very early on with that was the lack of a common standard in terms of effective risk management. A lot of confusion in the early days where people were actually working on the basis that eradication was possible, and therefore immunity passports would be available, etc. Our view was that was not going to be the case. Suppression would ultimately be the best strategy in the absence of a vaccine. And what suppression requires is risk management, and the absence of an effective risk management tool for entry or crossing borders was one we saw very, very early on. And that's still the case, to be frank with you. But what we've been trying to do, and bear in mind our purpose to enable business worldwide, to secure peace, prosperity, and opportunity for all, is actually developing a tool, a standard, which can be applied, which would actually incorporate the latest and most effective science in terms of what is effective testing for a given time, and ensuring that a trusted tool is used which is effectively basically enabled by the ICC. I mean, as everyone knows, hopefully most of you won't know this on the call, we're a not-for-profit, complete for purpose. And when we attach our ICC brand to something, it's because we see the purpose is aligned to our purpose, which is enabling business. And what we're trying to do here in developing this tool, ICC AOK Pass, is to create a trusted vehicle or a trusted tool which citizens can rely on. Because one of the elements we see as critical to the success of managing to live with COVID and actually enabling livelihoods is high degrees of trust have to be reposed, and you actually have to exhibit a trustworthiness. ICC has those elements, and it's important that citizens trust us. And it's important that citizens trust their governments when they open up the borders. And so we have been fighting, I think, it's a battle to actually get the right level of focus on the right issue. And I think we've now got to a point where governments realize that in opening up their economies, it's actually about risk management. And how do you then deploy and enable a tool that can allow that to happen, which is where ICC AOK Pass comes in. Because effectively what this tool does is it creates a digital rails. It creates a high trust application which can incorporate the most recent science on the most effective testing, which doesn't reveal complete eradication, but what it can do can ensure that if you hop on a plane, that if everyone else has been subject to verification through ICC AOK Pass, then you have confidence and trust that the likelihood of you being infected while on that plane is almost close to zero. But that's not what we have at the moment. And in the danger we see is with governments operating different mechanisms, we're going to end up with a lack of risk management and actually confusion, which will undermine trust by citizens in traveling. And the reason we're focusing on travel is that particularly in developed and developing countries, one of the value chains which has been most completely destroyed has been the travel and tourism value chain. And off that hangs the future of a lot of SMEs and micro SMEs. So one of our jobs is to get that going. Everyone tells you that the most effective way of doing this is to be tested before you hop on that plane, get on that boat, get on that train, take that truck across the border. But governments still are convinced that they need to test people on arrival. The problem with that is that in the period of travel, you are subject to and actually open to infection, which is why it's so important to actually build the apparatus that we have to enable pre-testing, continuous visibility of the results of that testing, having that available before you get on the plane, get on the boat, get on the bus, and actually to be double tested, to be double checked when you get to the airport, the train station, the port, etc. That's how you create a risk management tool which is effective. The only way you can do that is not country by country. It needs to be multilateralized. You need to have the confidence that citizens traveling to your country from a variety of countries are subject to the same standard, and actually applying the same standard, which is what we're offering with, and only the ICC can do that. With the failure of multilateral institutions, we are the only multilateral institution with our for-purpose mission that can enable that to happen. And what we've done is then built very carefully the network that can support that. So you'll be hearing later from Shami from International SOS, and then also we won't be talking today with SGS, the largest standard verifier in the world. And the reason we've linked up with these two is to actually support the high trust which is required. So International SOS has a network of trusted attestors, which is clinics and doctors who are subject to audit, who are capable of verifying by their electronic signature what the person's COVID-19 status is against the test which is required by a government which is opening up their border and enabling travellers to actually cross their borders. So that's what ISOS can do. SGS, with its standards setting, it's the largest standard setting in the world, can actually verify that as well. So we create a trust cocoon in a way. And the ultimate endpoint of that is the verification through a QR code, which recognizes the digital signature of a doctor who attests that the individual has actually complied with the status required by an incoming receiving country to actually receive that passenger, that traveler, or whatever. And of course, it can be used for return to work as well. But we're just focusing on this at the moment. Focusing on this as well because one of the challenges is that governments, absent this sort of global leadership, are incredibly slow to actually acknowledge this is what needs to happen. It's starting to happen, as Dorji said, and Chester will attest to. I think we've been in discussions now with almost 30 different sovereigns, all of whom recognise the need for this. None of which at the moment have been prepared, though people are getting closer because they're now realising this is about risk management to actually sign off on this. And that's exactly what citizens need and what citizens are demanding, actually. So one of our challenges is to get that in place. We're talking with IATA, ICAO, we're talking international road users, we're talking with the World Tourism and Travel Corporation. We're engaged in quite substantive discussions. We're doing pilots, they're all working, it's all successful. At the moment, we're in a series of discussions, particularly with the Italian government, the Spanish government in Europe, the Greek government in Europe. We're actually trying to work our way through the complexity of the European Commission. And let me tell you, that's actually not without its challenges. We're also talking in Southeast Asia with the Thai government, with the Filipino government, with the Singapore government, in Latin America with the Colombian government, and we can go on. In the Pan-Arab world, we've actually opened discussions there with Saudi Arabia. We're working with the G20. So in order to establish I think the credibility, we've actually had the discussions, done the tests, done the pilot. That's all there now. Now the challenge is to actually get this international cooperation. And that's one of that's part of the journey that we're on at the moment. Anyway, that's kind of where we are. The experience to date is that some countries that were seen last time we met as the success stories are now thinking twice about whether they want to have that moniker, because some of them are now challenged. I mean, when we last spoke, Singapore was being heralded as a success story around the world. I think it still is, but clearly it's got some challenges. So it's the idea that lockdown is over there is over. Australia was seen as a success story, but I think some of you would have seen already that there's been an outbreak in Melbourne, in Victoria, and that's put the country back into lockdown. But I think the four elements of success that we're seeing is simply where there's a competent state apparatus, where there's a government that citizens trust, where there's strong civic engagement, and there's leadership. Absent any one of those four, things start falling apart quite quickly. The maintenance of those four seem to keep the show moving a lot better. And maybe we can discuss that later on. Maybe I'll stop there though. Thanks, Dorji. Thanks, everyone.
No, thanks, John. And I think we'll come back to the actual ICC AOK pass with Chester's comments, but we've actually had a few questions and comments in the chat. So for people who are attending the webinar, if you were to look on the right-hand panel, there is a running chat where you are able to post questions. So for later on, John, we had an interesting question around countries dealing with sanctions and also now dealing with COVID-19. Louise Wiggett, hi Louise. She also made a great comment about how, in terms of different regions being affected at different times, Africa is now being heavily affected, and that's now starting to make import and export complex and tricky for businesses. And later on, when we get to Chester, he'll also be able to talk about some of the different pilots that we've been implementing. We've also had a very interesting question from Joyce asking whether or not the ICC is going to undertake a study on whether cryptocurrency can be an alternative or complementary intervention to mitigate constraints in trade finance liquidity. Could this be a novel intervention for this question? And Joyce, I'll make a quick comment and then I'm going to go straight away to Dr. Sham. But essentially, Joyce, this is something that the ICC is looking at. So my role as CEO of Perlin is to be the blockchain partner. And what we've done is we've built several pilots, everything from supply chain traceability, which is actually now relevant for vaccines, which Prof Chester can talk about. But also what we've been looking at is this trade financing being affected by decentralized financing. So different ways for creating a digital bill of lading as collateral for some form of token, which can also ease trade finance. And so this is where Perlin was able to work with the ICC partnering with International SOS and SGS to create the ICC AO KPass. Prof. Chester will talk more about it, but it uses Ethereum and it uses a blockchain signature to allow for what is an interoperable global standard, as John said, because in this current trade war environment, it's highly unlikely that the Chinese government would accept a Google, Apple Health Pass, which is what they've developed, or that America would accept a WeChat-based Alipay developed Health Pass, which is what the Chinese are using. So what can intermediate and interoperate an organization like the ICC with global representation and something like a public blockchain? So Joyce, if you would like to talk more about this, it's a fascinating area that we are doing some work around, and please feel free to reach out to us directly. And thank you very much. That was a very astute question. So now I'll move to the corporate experience of COVID-19, and there's going to be a few slides shared and a bit of background. But Dr. Sham, would you like to take it over now? And also, all of the speakers will be on mute in between speaking, so you can just turn off the audio mute and commence speaking. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dorji, and thank you everyone for joining the session. So I just wanted to start a little bit by just saying that yes, this pandemic continues to rhythm the lives of just about all of us globally. And I can tell you, based on the multitude of calls that we receive at International SOS, we understand that organizations and individuals like yourselves are completely inundated with this COVID, this completely novel pandemic. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about us at International SOS, and so you can understand, that we've been monitoring the situation and the information we receive right from the inception. So we've got a team that literally collates information, and we sort of analyze the data. And what I'm trying to represent here on this slide is where we get the information from. So this dedicated team is a mix of medical information specialists, and they comprise of doctors, nurses, public health specialists, and we've been undertaking what we call non-traditional surveillance. And this has been going on for about 20 years now. So we gather information from many sources, the public and the private, the official and the non-official. And most importantly is that we leverage our medical resources on the ground. And I think this is especially apparent during these times of COVID, where we've had, and we still do have personnel on the ground within almost every country. We had people on the ground in Wuhan, when it was very much the epicenter of this disease. We currently have clinics and we have network providers in remote zones. So Lagos, Nigeria, we've got just about representation on the globe. So apart from the credible sources like WHO, CDC, the Johns Hopkins, we've been monitoring the situation from the ground ourselves. Now, we do have a very strict vetting process before we go ahead and disseminate the analysis. And more hierarchical authorities like the WHO and CDC talk about these infodemics, this incorrect information that's being widely spread and distributed on the internet via various social media platforms, talking about cures and different preventative measures that are being counted. And what we're seeing literally is a lot of fake sensationalized news circulating with almost, but not quite the right amount of information. There's lots of people, that are adding on conjecture, speculation, adding on their own interpretation, and very often missing the exact precision and missing the perspective. I think one of our key messages to you today also is to keep monitoring the situation, but ensure that you've got accurate information in a timely manner. And there'll be many uncertainties over the next few months. And I think everybody needs to primarily know how to respond. And that's been, from our analysis, one of the key differences of the current COVID-19 pandemic compared to previous predecessors in terms of the absolute rampant spread of fake news that's just fueling and feeding the rumors and the stigma and the fear. And this can really prove harmful to individuals and organizations. So I think just we partner with our clients to ensure that both human and asset protection is protected in this continued fight for lives and livelihoods, as John alluded to. So basically, I think if I give you a brief 360 of what's going on from a medical perspective, the global trend is certainly continuing at a very increased, sharp incline, and this is largely due to escalating resurgences within the US. The Americas are certainly a point of concern at this point. I think South America, India, Russia, persistently relatively slower is the growth in Africa. But I think when we look at Africa, there's a lot of concerns about the level of reporting and the level of healthcare overall. I think if we look at the leading contributors currently, and that's changing because various countries are always at different levels on this pandemic curve, the main concerns in the top 5 are certainly the US, Brazil, India, Russia, Peru, Chile, and Mexico. But I think nobody, and this pandemic has proven how marvelously interconnected we are as a global human community. I just want to reiterate here and pause and just let you know that the reported case numbers simply reflect the scope of testing. And they're not particularly an accurate number, not by a long shot, nor in fact is the death rate. So I just wanted to also touch on some key points from a medical perspective in terms of global developments. I think vaccines is very much a topic that's on the forefront of all our minds. And when we look at the race for a viable COVID-related vaccine, that's continuing at a breakneck pace. And, preliminary evidence definitely seems to show that people do mount an initial immune response. The data, however, remains limited at this juncture. And definitely there needs to be some sort of further consensus and wider testing in terms of the length of conferred immunity, and indeed if there will indeed be any lasting immunity and what the implications are therefore. But what I want to reassure you guys is there are certainly over 155 vaccines being researched globally that's specific to COVID-19. 23 of these are currently in various phases of human trials, so that's pretty reassuring. The New England Journal has recently, publicized the Moderna phase 1 findings, and I think there certainly seems to be an interest in safety and effectiveness. Typically, just to give you a background, vaccines take years of research before they really quickly available for wide-scale manufacturing, distribution, and administration. But scientists are definitely racing on this one, and we're aiming for something as early as next year. So some credible research and viable contenders are ongoing. But again, a point that you guys need to bear in mind is a definite vaccine and specific therapeutics to COVID at this juncture remain at large. So there's nothing definitely widely available. I think the next key point that's very much contentious and brings in some sort of misunderstanding is the use of face masks. And I think the CDC just within the last few days have released more evidence and guidance encouraging and supporting the use of face masks and face coverings generally. They cite evidence of clear evidence of reduced transmission. And this is especially apparent within countries where the escalating epidemic is largely believed to be attributed to poorly enforced mandates on face coverings and poor adherence to social distancing and other public health measures. So I think overall, there is this drive to enhance and support well-informed, supported, compliant individuals. What I just want to add is masks should only ever be used as part of a comprehensive package of interventions. There's no silver bullet. There's certainly no black or white answer. And masks alone cannot stop this pandemic. I think the benchmark must continue to actually be, active finding, testing, isolating, and treating of every case, and then again, every contact. So I think we need to handle masks in the context that it belongs to a broader understanding. With regards to transmission, I think the key drivers of this transmission certainly remain, close contact with potentially infected individuals and their infected respiratory droplets, as well as secondary transmission by virtue of potentially touching infected, contaminated surfaces and then introducing that infection into your internal environment by virtue of your hands. So you touch your face, you touch your eyes, you touch your nose, you touch your mouth. It's about playing the inner and the outer game. Interestingly, the WHO has officially acknowledged as of the 9th of July that it is possible for COVID to be transmitted through aerosolized spread. I think initially it was always maintained that aerosolized was restricted to healthcare settings. This data still remains limited for now. But it's now been added on that aerosolized spread can become prevalent in certain super spreader community events, like larger gatherings and large-scale entertainment events, especially where there's a general lack of other public health measures. So I think, what John touched on in terms of the waves and the resurgence and, countries that once stood tall are now giving into second and third waves. And at the start of this pandemic, the expectation was very much that it would either behave similar to previous influenza pandemics that basically saw successive waves of outbreaks with limited activity in between waves, or the premise was that it would behave like SARS in 2003 with a single wave that just disappeared after 8 months. But the bleak reality here and what we're seeing and struggling with and the new perception of the COVID pandemic pattern appears to be one of a cyclical pandemic. And we're certainly seeing the cycle that's consisting of periods of limited activity, remitting, followed by increased activity and the relapsing. So I think when we see the relapsing, it's certainly, prevalent as countries start to lower restrictions and start to look at more innovative travel. And the truth is that the one constant in this experience thus far has been the way the virus behaves. It consistently looks for opportunity to infect. It's just been our responses as a global community that has been variable. I think the next quick one, just to touch on antibodies and immunity, I think very, very prevalent right now. Everyone's looking out for what's being said. Certainly one of the big questions, especially for people who have been infected with the coronavirus and recovered. They want to understand what's the role of antibodies, what's the role of immunity, especially going forward. How long is this going to be valid for? Looking at the larger picture, what would this mean for society's reopening for things like immunity passports? So a quick overview and testing, I think where we stand, we can either test for the virus or we test for the antibodies in the blood. And virus testing generally is extremely accurate, especially if technique and lab support's in place. I think testing for the virus, the RT-PCR remains the benchmark or the gold standard. Antibody and antigen testing from a rapid diagnostic testing perspective, certainly a broader representation of an individual's potential immune response, but there's still a lag in terms of reliability and in terms of sensitivity. So I think at this juncture, the benchmark would be the RT-PCR, and additionally, we have to understand. And there certainly needs to be larger randomized trials in terms of, peer-reviewed and publishings. But the preliminary evidence for now seems to suggest that the antibody responses starts to decline between 20 to 30 days after someone first experiences COVID symptoms. Now, the severity of symptoms, may be linked to the magnitude of the antibody response, and this is certainly something that's still being investigated. So in other words, the sicker you were, the more likely you are to have a more robust antibody response. And that's based on the preliminary evidence thus far. So I think in addition, at this stage, there is no evidence to support that rapid diagnostic testing or detecting antibodies are a reliable indicator of sustained or conferred long-term immunity. But there's still so much we don't know on this topic, and more research is certainly needed because the implications are certainly important, especially if we look at resumption of travel, if we look at certainly a newer, safer normal for everybody. And I think if we look at the hierarchical guidance from authorities like CDC and the WHO, at first the focus is certainly on reducing mortality and suppressing transmission. Secondly, it's certainly to encourage and harness empowered, engaged individuals and communities who are cognizant of their individual behavioral contributions to this virus. And I think lastly, there is a reiteration on the need for strong governance, certainly leadership, certainly coordination, ensuring that comprehensive strategies are communicated clearly, consistently, and frequently, updating to the evolving nuances of this virus. And the global initiative certainly appears to be more an acceleration on science, and it's also enabling innovative, flexible platforms like the AOK Pass within the framework of solidarity and a cohesive global response. And this obviously starts with individuals and organizations like yourself. So I think I just wanted to quickly touch on, a recent poll that International SOS did. And this was basically conducted across our client base. And a little bit of a background, as you may know, International SOS partners with more than 2/3 of the Fortune 500, in offering very bespoke, nuanced, innovative travel, medical, security, risk-related solutions. And this survey was conducted to intimately understand how businesses viewed and prepared for a return to operations. It was done over 1,000 businesses across different business lines. And, some of the findings were that 64% cited that pre-existing pandemic plans were effective in reducing the current COVID-specific impact, whilst a fifth did not have any of this in place, period.
And Dr. Shan, sorry, I do apologize. Are you able to move through the slides in the next couple of minutes, please? We have some time for questions, and we're already at the 42-minute mark, but thank you so much. Keep going.
Not a problem. So if we look at the next factor, I think 82% of, the police basically cited country lockdowns, and 56% cited international border controls as the top two largest impactors on their business continuity throughout the pandemic thus far. And if we look at the third part of it, it was basically 73% believe that a second wave or multiple waves could potentially further detrimentally impact their business continuity even worse. So I think importantly, we've identified top 5 actions that are being taken by organizations to ensure safe return. And, of these are the ones cited, and it certainly updates to your business continuity and procedures, having that on the ground support in terms of location, health, security, logistic expert, are fundamental in ensuring risks are mitigated as much as possible. And that added layer of assurance that if and when urgent help is required, it can be readily accessible. I think when we look at COVID-19 compliance monitoring tools, very top on the agenda, especially for tracking, tracing, commonly spoke of in the media and organizations, but still I think organizations struggle in terms of, actionably reporting on these techniques. I think fit for work health screening, certainly not a new concept, especially to certain sectors, but now the norm for almost every organization. Fortunately, we have digital innovations at hand, like the OK Pass, but selecting an international provider that meets compliance, meets security and privacy is integral as part of your partnerships. And mental health support, I think, should be prioritized. And the pandemic seems certainly to have accelerated, or as I believe, highlighted this need. So I think that's
fantastic. Thank you so much. So why don't we jump into an example of ICC AOK Pass being applied with International SOS. So Prof. Chester, did you want to potentially talk about the Singapore, Thailand maritime example?
Yeah, can everybody hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Excellent. Yeah, so, as has been emphasized, the background of medical concern and need is really extreme. And of course, the science is always moving, and that's one of the fascinating things about this whole COVID is that science itself develops with time, but business owners need certainty to plan ahead. So one of the things that the ICC has really helped to bring to the forefront is some of this advanced technology that had been actually developed for financial technology, fintech. So some of you may know about blockchaining and the way in which blockchains create trust against parties. In fact, they can create trust to the degree where completely anonymized trade partners can interact with large financial transactions and have complete trust in the execution of those transactions. The interesting thing is many of those same technologies now are highly applicable to healthcare information, which has never been the case before. And so what the ICC did was marry some of the fundamental processes that it's used to create trust in trade interactions, such that health information itself can be used transnationally. And that's really where we come to the AOK Pass. So I'll just talk real quick about one of the pilots we've done, but it made some shipgoers very happy. So the pilot was as follows. So we used the ICC technology to document and authenticate test results with International SOS here in Singapore from a very high quality hospital. A set of shipgoers, mariners, got on their ship and then arrived in Thailand. And so the nice thing is that the test results in Singapore were recognized in Thailand, a different jurisdiction. And what practically worked for them was they would have had a quarantine, but they were able to serve their quarantine on the boat. I mean, there's nowhere else to go. So what the ICC infrastructure did in that setting was it transferred the trust of the clinical testing in Singapore to the arrival port, in this case in Thailand. And that we'll have some press coming out for that particular pilot, but that is a travel corridor where efficiency is created within a trade process, within travel, by virtue of an ICC infrastructure, and it was quite nice. So I know that members of this that are watching this now come from a wide range of international representation. And I'd say clearly that these are the kind of pilots that we can do ethically, and we can structure. It takes a little bit of work, but it's absolutely what we can do. And the more that we can do, the more we can establish these trust networks and rebuild international commerce. And I'll just close with saying, COVID by itself is dreadful, but the reality is that if we can rebuild systems the way they're meant to be rebuilt, that coming out of this over the long term, as you amortize this, the injury of COVID-19, we might actually be able to make things much better. And copy some of the best practices that ICC has put in place in terms of international trade into health information practices and other types of information flows that are appropriately structured and governed at an international scale. So I'll leave that, and any specific questions we can answer. But the great news is not only do we have the framework, we also have the execution ability to make it happen.
Thank you, Chester. I mean, so we do have 9 minutes left. So anyone who has questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat. And we actually do have a couple of questions which we'll come back to. But just on what you were saying, a few interesting case studies that do pop into mind. One of them was around events. One of them is around the partnership you've signed with Sanofi in regards to potential vaccines. One of them is in regards to even looking at the foreign worker situation with Temasek in Singapore. Maybe give a bit more context for the people who are listening, just in terms of how the partnership with SGS and International SOS and ICC have been able to triangulate with this standardized technology, just in some different contexts, just so people who operate different types of businesses can potentially apply this thinking.
So just a real quick example. And so what I just described is a framework, and the framework can be applied a lot of different ways. So as an example, Singapore is it's an island. It has a significant contribution of its economy from business tourism in the form of trade and event shows, and event trades, the F1 being particularly notable. So the question is, how can you have people come in for a conference when their testing is done in another country? You have that testing recognized in Singapore. They can go into the conference center, have their conference, and then go back home. I used to dread that type of travel. I must say, I've gotten to the point where I kind of miss it. So the AOK Pass is integrated now into a system where events organizers can use that clinical information. And remind you that the clinical information, testing information, medical information, that's not normal information. It has to be protected with absolute security when it's used in this way. And that protection is, of course, integrated into the AOK Pass system that's been designed for the first day. But the ability to use medical information to come in and out, do your business, that's something that we have with a completely implementable system right now. And so if anybody on the call thinks that might be of use for events, even, for example, large resorts, but this type of corridored system where you need to have people enter with recognition of testing and risk adjusted as they go, that's certainly something that we can do. Another example is Singapore is a wonderful place. It's very modern and it's always being undergoing construction. We have a lot of regional employees who come from let's just say lower income economies. And so they come here, they get a reasonable salary, a very good salary compared to where they came from, but they are housed in affordable accommodations in the most expensive country in the world. So they live in relatively densely packed dormitories in the north of Singapore. And so the problem is densely packed dormitories quickly become hotbeds of COVID infection. And the good news is they're almost all young, so the number of deaths has been extremely small. I think there's only one out of 25,000 infected individuals. But their return to work needs to be managed. So as an example, we're using AOK Pass to help structure that return to work of the dorm workers into construction sites. And the same framework is now being piloted into large mining communities. So mines and also the oil and gas industry are almost like little sovereign areas unto themselves if you've ever been to a large mine. So there, that's a controlled situation. You have to control the risk of COVID. And again, that's where this technology works really well. So as a physician, we've built this from day number one to accommodate the medical risk of patients and protect their medical information. So that's exactly the framework that we're putting into these systems, and we're re-operationalizing businesses while at the same time protecting employees, and actually many of the employees, it's somewhat vulnerable employees at that. So balancing ethics and reopening and operationalizing of businesses, that's been the challenge that we've set out for ourselves, and I think that's the main reason we're getting a lot of global leverage at the moment.
Thanks, Chester. So we've got three burning questions, and we've got about 6 minutes left. So what I'll do is, I think that the questions are quite straightforward, and I'll just talk through them. But after that, we'll go to each of the panelists for a closing remark, in terms of where they see this going. But just really quickly, I thought a very pertinent question from Victor Mills. Hi, Victor. It was really, what are we trying to achieve from this webinar, and how can we all help? So just, I think just simply we're starting to showcase some of the work, some of the technology that the ICC has built and is deploying. What we actually found, tying this into the question from Louise, she asked, how do you manage the acceptance between Singapore and Thailand? Mutual recognition seems like a big hurdle. So coming back to your question, Victor and Louise, what we had in that circumstance was the Port Authority in Thailand of Songkhla accepted the recognition of the test and the pass from Singapore, from Raffles Medical Center. So coming back to these types of, like, what we want from the webinar, if there are any people on the call who are from a Chamber of Commerce or from an organization that would like to run a pilot, please reach out to us. The website is just aokpass.com. And anyone, for example, from an authority, we're looking at maritime authorities, port authorities, because as Chester said as well, mining companies often are their own authority. So coming back, there's a few more questions. Maybe Chester, if you want to answer the question from Natalia, where is the medical data stored and how does an individual give access to that? Maybe that's in your architecture sort of background. Yeah.
Natalia, that's something we thought very carefully about, and so I've dealt, since I also do clinical research, I've dealt with GDPR and HIPAA issues for over a decade. I guess GDPR hasn't been around for a decade, but HIPAA has. That is architected into the system, and that's where the magic of the blockchain comes in. So the medical information never leaves the user's hand, but the authentication of the medical information, that's what goes through the blockchain. So we can talk in more detail about that, but this is, we feel this is a relatively bulletproof system that even in theory, there's probably no way to do it better in terms of you need to prove something with your medical information, i.e. that I'm COVID negative and can come into the mine or the airplane. But the actual information itself is not compromised, that creates that certificate. This is probably the best way, even theoretically, that one can do it.
Thank you, Chester. So, John, there's a couple of questions that I think are more relevant for you. Javaid Bassini has asked, is the deployment of AOK Pass going to be internationally simultaneous or regional wise? And then Hanan Abdul has asked, in many countries, the public health system is not necessarily at a reasonable standard. And in that case, is there going to be a gap in terms of acceptability of health information with the ICC AOK Pass? Will some ICC members be marginalized? And how do you address that? You're on mute, by the way, John.
Shouldn't be. Is that on now?
You got it.
Okay. Just quickly, and thanks very much for the questions and thanks for the participation. Our preference would be for this to be deployed multilaterally, but the reality is that as I was saying in my comments, the level of cooperation globally is so low at the moment that we actually have to go region by region and country by country. And what we're actually looking for, just using the European Union, for example, is a country like Greece or Portugal or Spain or Italy that will actually say, we want to go with this. And it's only when they say that the European Union will actually feel moved to actually start the coordinating process around this. Otherwise, they'll spend endless hours testing and concentrating. As I said before, they're obsessed originally with immunity passports, which we've always been of the view that's, with the vaccine so far away, that's not going to happen now. They're shifting to risk management. So we need, and by the way, Bill asked, how can you help? I think you need to actually put pressure on governments to understand that they need to have a highly trusted, organizationally endorsed application like ICC, because as Dorji said, China's not going to accept a Facebook-enabled one. US is not going to accept a WeChat-enabled one. We actually need one which will actually have interoperability, and we can deliver on that. On the issue of accessibility, I think one of the reasons we partnered with ISOS, as Shami said, was because of the depth and nature of their and scale of their accessibility. We're actually not looking for a hospital to sign off in your country. We're actually looking for an attestor who's been signed off by ISOS, and that is available on their website. So that can be something that can help. Dorji, unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave this call because I've got to chair a regional conference. But can I just say thank you to everyone for participating. Every time we have the opportunity to talk about this, what we also find is that people see the relevance of it. We do want to engage, and so thanks very much for those who've already indicated, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. We know there's a really pressing issue on road transport there. We're discussing that at ICC. We're working with IRU, and we can work with you, but actually if there are individuals on this call who actually want to get involved, we're more than happy to help. So thank you very much, everyone, and look forward to catching up next time. And thanks, Thomas, for pulling this together. I'll leave the call now.
Thanks, John. And so
Thank you, John.
We're over time, but let's just please, we'd love the panelists to have any closing remarks or closing questions or closing thoughts. And Dr. Sham, I think, ISOS is such a global and amazing organization, but often is untrumpeted, in terms of some of their achievements. So if you had any final comments or thoughts or case studies of where you're working in the COVID space that you'd like to share, or for example, to the 100+ sort of audience, if there are any people that you would like to offer initiatives or things that you're working on, I would love to hear from you and your closing comments.
Thank you, Dorji. I think just traditionally, if we look at international SOS, it's always been, travel magnifies risk. Whatever way you look at it, that risk profile is travel is magnified with or without a pandemic like COVID in tow. And I think when we look at businesses returning to operations and returning to mobility, and that mobility could either translate into imminent domestic travel or resumption of international travel, I think political and economic pressures are going to be there, and having partnerships with strategic people and organizations can actually lessen that sort of risk and help you better understand and mitigate risks, and basically guide you through the entire process. And just to add on that, when it comes to international SOS and our network providers that we often leverage on, we have to be cognizant that standards of medical care vary. They can vary within countries. Let's take Asia, for example. There's some countries that are extremely advanced and up to international standard, but there are some countries that are just not credible. So I think with international SOS, we're extremely pedantic about ensuring that standards of medical care are adhered to. And we have what we call our Global Assistance Network team, as well as a whole host of internal proprietary software that ensures that we visit and we attest these weird and wonderful remote places and ensure that the providers we add on and the support we add on actually meet international standards. So I think that's what we've leveraged on our sense of excellence and how we partner with our clients to enable safe travel and to ensure business continuity.
Thank you, Shamandri. And I think that you mentioned, travel being an accelerant, but it's also one of the best parts of life. Chester, final comments from you? You're on mute.
No real final comments. I just think that, for the business community that's likely represented on this call, the setting of COVID is an extreme injury to revenue and trade, but there are solutions out there. But as a community, the business community probably needs to work together to pressure governments into finding sensible solutions to return to work. And the good news is, COVID doesn't have any allies. It's not like a world war where there's one side versus the other. No one on earth likes the COVID. So, it is something we can all work together, both from the science and the business perspective. So, when businesses want to make that happen, the ICC and I think our approach is specifically designed to make that advocacy and implementation safe and effective. So we were really excited about the ability to deploy. We can use all the help we can get.
Thanks, Chester. I think for me, the final comment would be, in a world pre-Trump, I think everyone would imagine that a president like a President Obama would bring the G20 together. There would be trust in medical research and WHO. There would be global approaches. Travel would not be as fragmented as it is today. I mean, it's emblematic that the fact that, Singapore, which is probably one of the most global cities in the world, is still closed, or even for a green lane to China, you have to be tested both in China and on arrival. And so I think what everyone should be looking at is the 3rd of November. I think that the COVID crisis, a potential silver lining for globalism, is that the Trump presidency could be over. And were Biden to win, what would 2021 look like? So I think that, the scariest thing for me, is looking at how Fauci's comments today indicated that he thought this could be worse than the Spanish flu pandemic just because the first wave never ended. It's just continuing to go on and on. So as much as people may be wanting to turn their minds to other things, I don't think this is going away anytime soon. And with that, I hope everyone can thank the panel and welcome them probably to a sequel in another 3 months when things potentially could be getting even worse. But with that, that optimistic note, I'll hand back to you, Thomas, and thank you everyone for your time and attention this afternoon.
Great, thank you, Dorji, and thank you again for Sham, Chester, and John, who left, who had to leave, but for making the time to do this, and for the audience questions. I know we weren't able to get through everything, so we, like Dorji said, we'll hopefully do another one of these. And if you're interested, we do have a lot of videos on our channel. So we will continue to host live broadcasts on this topic, in addition to other trade topics like the Incoterms rules, cryptocurrency, leadership coaching, and others. So sign up on our website for free, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel for more. And ladies and gentlemen, this wraps up another episode of the COVID-19 briefing. See you next time. Thank you.